In 984 AD, on a stretch of canal near the town of Huayin, a barge loaded with grain did something no boat anywhere in the world had ever done before. It climbed a hill. Not with wheels, not with rollers dragged by oxen, not with teams of men hauling it over land on greased timber skids the way heavy cargo had always been moved past an obstacle. It simply floated forward through two wooden gates set a few dozen meters apart, gates that closed behind it and opened in front of it. And in the time it took to walk the length of the boat, the deck had risen several feet, lifted by a wall of water no one could see, only feel underfoot as the hull settled higher in the chamber. The crowd that gathered on the bank to watch had seen boats hauled overland on rollers before, at brutal cost in labor and broken hulls. They had never seen a boat simply rise through the earth itself, unbothered, and continue on its way as though the obstacle in front of it had simply stopped existing. This device was called a pound lock, and the man who built it, a minor local official named Chow Wei-yi, had not set out to invent anything the world had never seen. He held no grand title and commanded no army of engineers. China, roughly 600 AD. If you unrolled a map of the empire at the start of the Sui dynasty, you would see two Chinas that had almost nothing to do with each other, separated less by distance than by an accident of geology. The south, cut by the Yangtze and its countless tributaries, was drenched in monsoon rain for months at a stretch, carpeted in flooded rice paddies, and producing a food surplus so enormous that a single good harvest could, in theory, have fed the entire empire several times over. The north, where the political and military capital had sat for centuries, was dry, dusty, exposed on its open frontier to nomadic cavalry sweeping down from the steppe, and dependent on wheat and millet yields that failed with grim regularity whenever the rains that fed the south never reached that far north. Grain grown along the Yangtze was, for all practical purposes, useless to the government sitting in Luoyang or Chang'an unless it could physically get there, and the geography made that almost impossible. China's two great rivers, the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze in the south, both ran broadly east to west, draining into the sea hundreds of miles apart, and nothing in nature connected them. Moving rice from the Yangtze Delta to the northern capital overland meant months of travel by ox cart along roads that turned to axle-deep mud every spring, with an enormous fraction of every shipment eaten by the draft animals hauling it, stolen by bandits, or simply spoiled in transit before it ever reached a granary. An empire that could not reliably move its own food from where it grew to where it was needed was an empire perpetually one bad harvest, one flood, one blocked road away from famine and rebellion in its own capital.
Emperor Yang of Sui decided the answer was to stop treating China's rivers as separate systems entirely, and instead physically join them into one. Beginning in 605 AD, he ordered the construction of a canal system that would eventually link the Hai, Yellow, Huai, Yangtze, and Qiantang river basins into a single continuous inland waterway stretching more than 1,800 kilometers, roughly the distance from Paris to Moscow, dug almost entirely by hand, section by section, over the course of barely 6 years. The project unfolded in stages with their own names: the Tongji Canal linking the Yellow River to the Huai, the Yangzhou Canal pushing north toward the frontier garrisons, and the Jiangnan Canal extending the whole system south to Hangzhou. Contemporary chronicles claim more than 5 million laborers, men and women both, farmers pulled straight off their own fields at the height of the growing season, were conscripted for the project, and that hundreds of thousands of them died from exhaustion, disease, and outright brutal treatment on the work sites. The engineering itself required solving a problem no one in the region had solved at this scale before. The land between river basins wasn't flat, and a canal, unlike a river, has no natural slope of its own to carry water and boats downhill under gravity alone. Engineers had to cut through rising terrain by hand,
build earthen embankments strong enough to hold canal water up.
Here is the detail that gets lost every single time this canal is discussed, as though it had always been about grandeur and imperial vanity. It was not, in its original conception, built to impress anyone. It was built to solve one specific, brutal accounting problem that had nothing to do with pleasure barges or dynastic prestige. An empire's capital could not eat without southern rice, and southern rice could not travel far enough fast enough over land to matter before it rotted, was stolen, or simply never arrived at all. Nobody standing knee-deep in cold mud on a work crew in 605 AD, digging a channel by hand under the eye of an overseer with a whip, was thinking about uniting Chinese civilization north and south for the next millennium and a half. They were digging a ditch, one shovelful at a time, so that grain barges could go somewhere they currently could not go. Full stop. What that ditch turned into, once it was finished, connected, and running with water from one end to the other, was something almost nobody involved in the original project, least of all the laborers who died building it, could possibly have predicted, or would likely have cared about, even if they had.
And the first people to discover exactly how much more this canal could do were not emperors or generals issuing grand proclamations. They were merchants, boatmen, and grain transport officials of the following Tang and Song dynasties, for whom an entire interior of China suddenly became reachable by water instead of by cart, opening trade routes that had simply never existed before at any scale. By the 8th and 9th centuries, the canal carried not just tribute rice, but salt, tea, silk, timber, and porcelain, moving in both directions between a south that grew and manufactured nearly everything and a north that consumed nearly everything. The city of Yangzhou, sitting at the precise junction where the canal crossed the Yangtze, exploded from a modest river town into one of the richest cities on Earth within a few generations, its docks packed with merchant boats from a dozen provinces at once, its markets, according to Tang Dynasty poets, so brightly lit at night with hanging lanterns that visitors compared the reflected light on the water to a second moon rising out of the river itself. The poet Du Mu would later write of losing an entire decade to what he called his Yangzhou dream, a phrase that stuck in Chinese literature for 1,000 years afterward. No overland caravan route in Chinese history had ever been able to move this volume of goods this reliably, because no overland route had ever needed to survive nothing more dangerous than an occasional muddy bank. A single canal barge, moved along by tow ropes and human labor rather than pack animals prone to injury, disease, and theft, could carry a cargo that would have needed dozens of ox carts and weeks longer to deliver over land.
This same period exposed a problem that made the whole system dangerously unstable, and its solution was the invention that opened this story. The earlier flash locks, essentially simple removable dams built across the canal, worked by holding back water until a gap opened all at once, releasing a violent surge that boats were expected to ride straight through at speed, aiming for a narrow gate while a wall of water tried to smash them sideways against the banks. Boatmen died on this stretch of canal constantly, and cargo losses were routine. Zhao Weiyu's solution in 984 AD, the pound lock, replaced this single dangerous chute with two gates set a controlled distance apart, forming an enclosed chamber that could be filled or drained gradually rather than all at once, raising or lowering a boat gently and predictably between two water levels with no surge and no violent current at all. It was, in effect, a staircase for water rather than a waterfall, and it let a canal climb terrain that would otherwise have been genuinely impassable for cargo of any real size, safely and repeatably at any hour and in any season. European canal engineers would not build anything resembling a functional pound lock until the late 14th century, roughly 400 years after Zhao Weiyu, and even then they arrived at the idea independently through their own trial and error, rather than learning it from Chinese engineering. Combined with regularly spaced granaries, relay stations, and a permanent core of canal officials whose entire career existed to manage water levels and boat traffic,
the canal turned from a single risky corridor into a genuinely dependable transportation system, one an emperor could actually plan a year's grain supply around. But this was only part of what the canal built, because alongside the grain barges, an entire way of life grew up along the water, generation after generation, largely invisible to the court officials who thought of the canal purely as an administrative pipeline. Whole towns existed for no other reason than the canal passing through them. Boatmen's guilds that regulated wages and settled disputes among crews who might spend more nights on the water than on land. Lockkeeper families who had operated the exact same gate for so many generations that the position had effectively become hereditary. Warehouse districts stacked floor to ceiling with goods waiting for the next convoy. Canal-side temples built and funded by merchants asking the local river gods for safe passage before every major voyage. And entire communities whose only meaningful connection to the rest of China was the water flowing past their own front door. This was exactly the same logic that turned the Chinese ocean-going junk into a tool for settling the coasts of Southeast Asia a few centuries later. Once a route becomes safe and predictable enough, day after day, year after year, it stops being merely a way to move cargo from one point to another and starts becoming a place where people build their entire lives, raise children, bury parents, and pass down a trade, generation after generation, around the simple daily rhythm of boats passing through a gate. Yangzhou became perhaps the clearest example anywhere along the canal's entire length of a trade route turning into a genuine center of national life in its own right. By the height of the Tang, and again, even more spectacularly under the Qing, the city's merchant guilds, its enormously lucrative salt monopoly administrators, and its famously extravagant entertainment and courtesan quarters made it one of the wealthiest cities on the planet, a place where fortunes made anywhere in the empire's vast interior tended sooner or later to flow, simply because Yangzhou sat at the one geographic point where every major trade route between North and South China was physically forced to converge. Qing-era salt merchants based in the city became so staggeringly wealthy that popular legend still tells of one of them stacking silver ingots into an artificial mountain purely to impress a visiting emperor, a story almost certainly exaggerated, but repeated for centuries precisely because it felt true, of a city where fortunes seemed to appear out of nowhere along the water. Foreign travelers who managed to reach it, including, by his own account, Marco Polo more than half a millennium after the canal's first construction, described a metropolis whose river traffic alone dwarfed anything comparable he claimed to have personally seen in the trading cities of Europe or the Middle East, an assessment that, whatever its embellishments, reflected a genuine and enormous gap in scale between what canal-borne trade had built in China and what any comparable European waterway could support at the time. Then, in the early 15th century, the canal was reborn on a scale even Emperor Yang could not have imagined 9 centuries earlier. When the Yongle Emperor of the Ming Dynasty moved the imperial capital north to Beijing in 1421, the entire question of feeding the capital became, once again, a matter of moving southern grain a huge distance north. And the canal, silted and neglected for decades, had to be rebuilt almost from scratch along a more direct route through Shandong. The rebuilding ran into the same stubborn problem that had haunted every generation of canal officials before it. The summit crossing the Shandong watershed simply did not have enough water to keep the locks running through the dry season. The solution came not from a court-appointed hydraulic expert, but in a detail that echoes Chao Wei-yu's story almost exactly, from a local farmer and self-taught engineer named Bai Ying, who proposed damming the nearby Wen River at a spot called Nanwang and channeling its flow directly into the canal's highest point. It worked, solving in a single stroke a problem trained officials had struggled with for years. And the resulting network, the Caoyun, or Tribute Grain Transport System, eventually moved several million picos of grain northward every single year, carried by a dedicated fleet numbering in the tens of thousands of boats. and manned by a permanent transport corps of well over 100,000 boatmen, soldiers, and officials. An entire branch of imperial government whose sole function was keeping Beijing fed by water. No single road anywhere else in the world at that time moved anything close to this tonnage, this reliably across this kind of distance. And the capital of the largest empire on Earth quite literally could not have existed where it did. Without a canal built 4 centuries earlier for an entirely different dynasty's entirely different problem.
But of everything the canal built, nothing exposed how fragile the whole system had always secretly been, quite like a single catastrophic event in 1855. That year, the Yellow River, notorious for millennia for shifting its entire course without warning and earning itself the grim nickname China's Sorrow, broke its banks during a massive flood and abruptly changed its outlet to the sea by more than 100 kilometers, severing the canal's crucial northern link and burying long stretches under meters of silt no dredging crew of the era could realistically clear. The Qing government, already exhausted by the Taiping Rebellion tearing through the canal's wealthiest southern cities at almost exactly the same catastrophic moment, never fully restored the damaged northern sections. Grain that had moved by canal barge for well over 1,000 years increasingly moved by sea instead. And later, as the century closed, by an entirely new kind of transportation the canal had no answer for at all: the railway. The Tianjin-Pukou line, completed in the early 20th century, could move cargo along almost the same north-south axis in a fraction of the time, in any season, without a single lock gate or tow rope. What followed was not a single dramatic collapse, but a slow, grinding convergence of neglect, war, and changing technology that quietly ended the canal's 1,000-year role as the empire's circulatory system, section by section, decade by decade. Stretches silted up faster than shrinking, war-strained budgets could dredge them, and every year of deferred maintenance made the next year's repair bill larger and less affordable than the last. Warlord conflicts, and later the far greater upheavals of war and revolution, diverted whatever resources remained away from canal maintenance almost entirely. Stretches in the drier north, no longer fed by a reliable water supply after the 1855 flood severed the summit's sources, became seasonal at best and simply dry at worst, while lockkeeper families who had worked the exact same water for generations found the trade that had sustained their ancestors for 1,000 years quietly disappearing beneath them. The canal itself did not disappear. And this is the part of the story that surprises people who assume it survives today only as a historical curiosity or a tourist attraction. The southern sections, fed by the far more reliable water of the Yangtze Basin rather than the treacherous Yellow River, remained navigable and busy for exactly the same reason they had always been busy. Moving heavy bulk cargo by water is still, even today, in an age of highways and container ships, far cheaper per ton than moving it by road. Coal, sand, grain, and construction materials continue to move along the Jiangsu and Zhejiang sections of the canal in numbers that make it, by some measures of tonnage, one of the busiest inland waterways on the entire planet, carrying more freight in a given year than many people would assume possible for a channel first dug well over 1,000 years before the internal combustion engine existed. What changed over the centuries was never really the water itself, but the empire, and later the republic, that had once depended on every single kilometer of it functioning at once to keep a single unified political system fed and intact. For decades, almost everything the modern world knew about the earliest stages of canal construction came from official chronicles written centuries after the fact. Court histories with every institutional incentive to inflate the emperor's achievement, or, in Emperor Yang's case, to exaggerate the cost and cruelty of the project in order to justify the dynasty that overthrew him. That began to change with a series of careful archaeological excavations along the Sui and Tang era route,
including the discovery of the submerged medieval city of Xizhou near modern Huai'an, an entire town swallowed by shifting waters and mud centuries ago and rediscovered largely intact beneath the silt, its streets, foundations, and even household objects preserved almost exactly as they had been abandoned. This work culminated in the opening of the Grand Canal Museum in Yangzhou in 2021, built directly above and around excavated brick lock foundations, sluice gate remains, and sunken cargo boats recovered from the mud after more than 1,000 years underwater. For the first time, archaeologists could examine, layer by layer, exactly how successive dynasties had rebuilt, rerouted, and reinforced the same channel over more than 1,000 continuous years. Each generation of engineers, quite literally building directly on top of the physical work of the last, rather than historians relying purely on written accounts composed, in many documented cases, by officials who would never personally supervise the construction of a single lock gate in their lives.
And the story doesn't end in a museum display case behind glass. In 2014, UNESCO inscribed the Grand Canal as a World Heritage Site, recognizing not a single frozen monument from a vanished era, but an entire living, still functioning network stretching across 8 provinces and dozens of cities, substantial portions of which carry real commercial barge traffic every single day, more than 14 centuries after the first laborers began digging the earliest sections by hand under Emperor Yang's overseers. In recent years, sections of the historic route have even been folded into China's ambitious modern South-North Water Transfer Project, a vast engineering effort moving billions of cubic meters of water annually from the wetter Yangtze Basin to the parched cities of the north, once again solving, in the 21st century, almost exactly the same underlying problem that started the entire story 1,400 years earlier: how to move water and resources from a country's wetter half to its drier half, fast enough and reliably enough to matter.
This brings the whole story back to where it started, to a barge on a dangerous stretch of canal near Huaiyin in 984 AD, rising through a wooden gate as though the water itself had quietly decided to lift it uphill, without anyone having to push, pull, or drag it an inch. Nobody digging the very first stretch of canal in 605 AD, knee-deep in cold mud under an overseer's watchful eye, ever set out to build the artery that would feed Beijing for 5 centuries, turn a modest river town into one of the richest cities on Earth, or still be moving barges of coal along the same channel 1,400 years later. They were trying to solve a much smaller, much more immediate problem: how to get rice from a country that grew far too much of it to a capital that had none at all. They solved it with a shovel, an earthen embankment, and eventually, 4 centuries on, a pair of simple wooden gates built by a minor official with no grand ambitions of his own. And in doing so, they accidentally built the longest artificial waterway on the planet, one that held a divided empire together more securely and for far longer than any wall or standing army had ever raised to defend the very same border. The canal's dominance did not end in a single dramatic defeat, but in a slow convergence of shifting rivers, war, and steel rails laid along the very route it had once claimed for itself alone. And boats are still moving along stretches of it today, carrying cargo